All right, this is going to be part 2. And now we're going to move a little bit larger where we're going to look at larger structures in the brain. And so let's get started. And so here, when we look at this image, this is where you want to start your focus here. Begin at the subheadings that you see here. Cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, and brainstem. Make sure that you've memorized those locations first. And we have to know what each region is responsible for and some features that it has. So starting with the cerebrum. Cerebrum contains 2 hemispheres. Right now you are only seeing one, and we'll see other angles in a second. We'll see a second one. And they are divided by deep fissures, meaning that they have indentations in between them, and again, probably not going to be visible from this picture. But the deep fissures or deep grooves are going to be called fissures, and that's why you're seeing it here. That's going to be every line that can go deep. Like, I know that it's hard from a picture, but if you were to grab your finger and squeeze through that crack that you're seeing where that pointer is on this fissure here, you can go right through it because it's an open gash area. Same as this. You can go in and get really deep into the brain. And then as you go more superficial, like more to the surface. Here, the sulci, these are going to be smaller indentations. If you put your finger through these, you're not going to get very deep. It's just little tiny grooves, sulci. And then gyri are going to be the location that you feel on the top. So the surface, the top of the folds here, that's gyri. The cracks that don't go very deep are sulci, and the very deep cracks are going to be fissure. And so within the cerebrum, you have those particular grooves, and these grooves are what contain what we refer to as your cerebral cortex. Okay, remember the word cortex means area. Cerebral is this outer space on the outside where the cerebrum is. So that outer area, that is your cerebrum area or cerebral cortex, is made up of gray matter. Now, if you don't remember what gray matter means, you need to go back to the previous video. That gray matter has to do when you're looking at neural cell bodies. White matter has to do when you're looking at axons, okay, because all the myelin. Next, the major cortical functions, meaning the functions of that space of the cerebrum, are conscious thought, memory storage and processing, sensory processing, meaning things that are coming into your brain like eyesight, they go to a particular part of your lobe. If you're touching something, they go to this part of your lobe. If you want to move something, you send the command from this segment and out. So you see that's kind of what we mean by sensory processing. And control of skeletal muscles. If you want to control skeletal muscle, you can send a signal out. Remember that going into the brain is considered afferent. If your vision, right, you're over here on the eyes, you get into the brain, that's going to be afferent. You feel something touch, it goes into your spinal cord through the peripheral nervous system, goes up your spinal cord, and then you can feel something, and then you want to move it, you would use this segment here, and it would send a signal in an efferent direction. And then it would send a signal to control muscles outside of that spinal cord. Next we have our diencephalon. This is going to be what you see here, dead center, as our relay center. I like to think of it as a master controlling relay center. Thalamus, everything that you receive, okay, if you ignore this brain for a second and you think about your eyeballs, they send their input, what they see, into the thalamus. And then the thalamus is going to send it to the right lobe. Occipital lobe. If you touch something from the bottom of your body, it travels up your spinal cord, and then you touch it, it's going to go to your parietal lobe. So it processes every sense you have, the 5 that you have, right? Vision, touch, sight, smell, taste. And then we have balance, but again, that's our 6th sense. And they're all of them, when they come into the brain, they go straight to the thalamus. And then within there, you have sort of its relative, the hypothalamus, and it doesn't relay anything, but what it does is that it's in charge of the hormones in your body. Like, it is legit in charge of everything in your endocrine system. Like, everything that makes up all the glands in your body have to do with the hypothalamus. And so hormones, when you hear the word hormones, you are thinking about your hypothalamus, period. And it makes sense that it also does receive relay information, but from autonomic functions like heart rate, digestive. So it does technically still detect those things, but I'd rather you just know it as hormone production because it'll matter for our last class. And here now, thalamus, again, sensory relay and processing, sends it up, it goes into the spinal cord. If it's touch, comes from your spinal cord, goes here, and then it decides, okay, this is touch, it needs to go to this lobe. And if it's vision, travels inside of your brain, but eventually wants to go into the thalamus, then it sends it to the right space. So a relay center for the entire brain. Moving on. Next, we have our cerebellum, and our cerebellum is going to be in charge of balance, coordinate, modulate motor commands from cerebral cortex, means balance. It controls the balance in your body. It is about 10% of the volume, and most of the neurons, half of the neurons that you possess, the ones that do all the processing, the gray matter, 50% of it, all of it is primarily in your cerebellum. Isn't that crazy? And it's a smaller portion. Okay, so what this really means in context is that this is where you have the most sophisticated thinking occurring, the most sophisticated action potential networks occurring right in that region. And we'll see other pictures of it in a second, the inside of it. And moving on. When we look now at this segment here, we have our brain stem. And the brain stem is going to be made up of midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. It's always a little difficult to separate this from the diencephalon, so spend some time really knowing what the difference between diencephalon is and the brain stem is. It'll save you so much time if you just memorize this color scheme right here before moving on. Anywho, thalamus here, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Let's talk about these segments. And so midbrain is going to be a region that contains a bunch of important nuclei. And that's just a fancy word to mean a lot of cell bodies, right? When we say nuclei in the context of nervous system, this is plural. It's saying, oh, there's a bunch of cell bodies with nuclei here, not so much axons, gray matter, in other words. Okay, so I hope you've understood me by gray matter and white matter, and I've given you 2 warnings about it. Make sure you understand. Gray matter means a concentration of nucleus or cell bodies. And white matter indicates a bundle of a bunch of axons that have myelin sheaths around them. And so the reason that helps is to know is because the nuclei, again, is that the real processing center of a whole neuron. So that's why you need a bunch of them thinking on the same thing. Or, sometimes they need to go different places, but that's where they need to situate in a safe space within your brainstem. And so some examples of this are visual and auditory information, things that you see and hear, that's where they're going first. So the function of the midbrain is to process visual and auditory information. It controls reflexes that are triggered by both visual and auditory. Now, what that means is if I throw a baseball at your face and you see it, if I threw it slow enough, you can dodge it. Your muscles acted on it. If your eyes are closed, right, the room is completely dark, and then all of a sudden someone throws something in the room, you can hear or follow it with your head, like the sound a little bit. Your reflexes, right? And so that's what we mean by reflexes in this case, and that's what the midbrain hand does for visual and auditory, in conjunction with visual and auditory reflexes. And it helps maintain consciousness. It really helps regulate everything that's going on in your body, and that's really the simple way of thinking about it. Pons, it connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. That little hindbrain, again, that little lobe in the back that we saw, the cerebellum, the one that had 50% of neurons of the brain, it needs to connect to the rest of everything else. So it utilizes the pons to do so. And this is now where we understand now when we say the word tracts, okay, in anatomy, what that means, it's going to be a bunch of bundles of axons that are going to travel downwards. So you have to imagine to yourself that in here, in the midbrain, you have a bunch of nuclei, and I'm drawing now on the screen here for us. A bunch of nuclei, a bunch of cell bodies, and they all have their axons coming down. Okay? And these are axons. This is the cell bodies up here. Here's their nuclei. Right? Nuclei. And these are all their axons. They're going to be connected to stuff at the very end here. And so when we say nuclei in nervous system, we are saying that that's a region with a bunch of cell bodies. When we say, when a tract, that means that it's a region with a bunch of axons coming down. So this would be one tract, and the whole bundle would be one tract. Okay? That's pretty cool. That's just the terms you have to apply. So here, again, nuclei means a bunch of cell bodies. A bunch of the axons means tracts. And now next, when we look at this next center here, I'm trying to find my pointer here. Okay, somatic and visceral motor controls. Now this means body. This means digestive organs, motor control. So they also provide a pathway for the movement of things that are you don't want to take care of, like visceral motor controls, like smooth muscles, right? That's visceral motor control. That means that we don't want the stuff that we don't want to take care of about in our digestive system. And somatic means skeletal muscles. So they send tracts down that will eventually connect to the muscles so that you can move them. Now the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is going to be the last inferior portion of the brainstem. And this brainstem is going to relay information through to the thalamus. Nice and easy, right? Like when you think about the spinal cord, when you're feeling something, it goes in through the medulla oblongata. And as it travels through the medulla oblongata, and it's going to connect two things to the brainstem. Okay, it's a connector, like a little adapter. And then that's why it's so dangerous to get brainstem injuries, because they will cause everything that needs to relay. And what needs to relay there? Everything. All your conscious thought, all your ability to move, even like your ability to, like even up here as the midbrain controls some like important like the pons control visceral motor controls, like digestive. You damage this part, you can't digest things, your heart rate could stop, so it's dangerous to damage that segment. And so if you continue on here, regulates many autonomic functions. And that's why I went into that little rant, because I just want to remind you that the medulla oblongata controls a lot of things that you don't want to take care of. Heart rate, breathing rate, digestive rates, and if that's a thing. What is a thing? But here, autonomic functions, again, medulla oblongata. Everything that's automatic. Very important. Lobes now. When we look at our lobes now, these are going to be named after the skeleton, so you know them already. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and then a brand new one that you never heard of, not named after any bone, is going to be the insula. And the insula is not shown on this one, and I'll have to show you in lab when we get there, but it is visible on the next slide. And so these are going to be the regions you want to address now before moving on. Make sure you know your lobes, and because we're going to get into each one, what each one does. So now we're going to talk about some grooves now, because right now what we're seeing is a mid-sagittal section, meaning that it was sliced completely in half. Just compared to that first image that we saw, we are seeing half of it. Okay, we are seeing the inside. Here's our brainstem. Here's our medulla oblongata. Here's our pons. Here's our thalamus and hypothalamus. You'll notice that be able to recognize those four regions we talked about on this image before moving on. What is this region up here? The cerebrum, right? What is this little lobe back here, which has 50% of all the nuclei? Cerebellum. Here on the inside, the thalamus is going to be this little region, the relay center. Hypothalamus is the hormone controller. It's going to be right underneath it. So that means that this little region with it looks like a little eyeball, right? And then like a little beak. This whole region is the diencephalon. And then the brainstem is here, right? Here's our pons, medulla oblongata, and our midbrain lies right here, nice and hidden here. Okay, so you're seeing the same structures here. Make sure you can apply them to those images from the previous slides. And so with that, we have here our frontal lobe and our temporal lobe at the very bottom. You can only see it at the bottom. If we look at the little image here, here's our frontal lobe, here's our temporal lobe, and you'll see that there's a groove in between them. That groove can be seen from both sides, and that groove is called a lateral sulcus. There's one called parietal occipital lobe, and this one's a lot easier to learn, right? Because we know where our parietal lobe is now. This one in purple. Here we see occipital lobe is going to be the green one in the back, and you'll see that there's a division between them. So it's named after that, parietal occipital sulcus. They separate the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And if we draw it into our little image here on the right here, left here, that would be our parietal occipital lobe, separating our occipital versus our parietal. It's not going to be easy for me to write letters, so I'm trying my best here. So this is, again, the occipital lobe, and this one in red is the parietal lobe. And so, now when we look at the frontal lobe, you'll notice that there are two regions here. There's a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus. This last sulcus, central sulcus, is one that cuts the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. In other words, roughly around here. It looks like this one here. Okay. And this is going to be, the central sulcus is going to be a dividing region, again, between your frontal lobe and your parietal lobe. Okay, a divider, okay, between the two. But the cool thing about learning the central sulcus is that there is two regions that matter. That's this region, our precentral gyrus, and our postcentral gyrus. It's named after the fact that it's before the central sulcus, and this one's postcentral, or after the central sulcus. And they do different things. This precentral gyrus controls all your motor functions. It is the area that is primarily responsible just for the ability to move your muscles. And that's what the precentral gyrus does. That's its function. Know this. Postcentral gyrus function is to understand your feelings, what you're feeling with touch, pardon, not like emotional feelings. I mean like touch. Everything that, whenever you feel any sense of touch from your back, from your thigh, your toe, it is being processed. It comes into your body, right? Like when you feel it, the signal travels up into the thalamus, and then travels up into this segment where you feel it. You're like, oh, I'm touching my blanket. Oh, my partner's lover's hands is on we're holding hands and I feel it because it's always this soft. Or I can just touch. I don't know. I'm trying to like make relatable things here, but just touch. And then so it goes into that lobe. So now you can sort of understand that the parietal lobe in general is going to be responsible for handling all your touch. That's its superpower, is receiving all the touch information you're getting from your body. And the precentral gyrus is associated with your frontal lobe, which is going to be the region where you pretty much make your conscious choices to move, right? Because whenever you want to do anything, you want to will anything, what do you need to do? You probably need to move to make it happen. So your precentral gyrus is really where all those strict ability to move your muscles comes from. So they send directions in the opposite direction through the thalamus and down, all the way down. Remember we said the pons, they send tracts. See, you're seeing a tract here. Here's a bundle of axons. One's going up, one's going down, but a tract just means a traveling axon. And so, and up here, now, if you think about it in context, right here, this is where you would have some cell bodies. All of these regions here are going to be like cell bodies that are just organized right there on the surface there. and they're sending all their axons. They're either receiving things, they're dendrites, or they're sending things in their axon and they're going to connect somewhere else. But otherwise, a tract means things are connected when they're moving up and down. They're bundled together. Anywho, just sort of a little refresher from the last slide. Okay, now, what's next? Procentral gyrus, parietal lobe. And now we're understanding that our frontal lobe is, again, is for moving our skeletal muscles. Our primary motor and parietal is for somatosensory. And that's what this word means. Don't let it intimidate you. Somatic always means body. So that just means body senses. Body touch. Your body sense. Body touch. Now on this slide, it doesn't get that much harder here. This is actually going to be breakdown of the leech lobe and what they do. And you kind of already know them. Here our frontal lobe, again, has our precentral gyrus. It's going to be responsible for our primary motor controls. Okay. And its job is to direct movement or voluntary movement by controlling the motor neurons in the brainstem and spinal cord. Okay. So that means that in one way or another, they're going to have to go down, probably connect to the brainstem region, probably around the pons. It's going to synapse, and then it's going to go all the way down and connect somewhere else. Okay? And so that's what, when we say, sorry, I keep saying kid, it's driving me mad. It's just, there's no good transition. Anyways, so here, brainstem, spinal cord. You travel up, synapse goes down. Here would be where it connects. Okay? But still, all motor commands are coming from the motor cortex. And again, that's going to be in the precentral gyrus. And this means the area cortex responsible for motor movement, skeletal muscle movement. Premotor cortex is going to be the region right before. And how easy is that word? Premotor cortex. If this is your motor cortex, everything in that precentral gyrus, then the premotor cortex is going to be the area next to it, before it in a way. That's going to be responsible for learning skeletal movements. So things like walking when you're growing up, dancing, drawing, all that precision movement you need for your day-to-day activities is controlled by the premotor cortex. Next, if we go to number 2, sensory, you know this one, parietal lobe. It's going to be the area responsible for this. The postcentral gyrus is going to be the area that contains the primary somatosensory cortex, which again means the ability to detect touch and any element of touch, like how strong is that touch? How painful is that touch? How fast is that touch moving? And how hot or cold is that touch, right? Elements of touch. So touch, now those would be pressure, pain, vibration, or temperature. Somatosensory association area is going to be the area that recognizes or you distinguish between things. Like if I put a penny in your pocket and then I put a cotton ball in your pocket and then I put some eyedroppers in your pocket, you put your hand in there, you can kind of feel the texture, you can feel the material, and then hey, this is the penny, this is the cotton ball, you can distinguish between different sensations through that sensory cortex. Here, the auditory cortex next. Oh, sorry, no, number 3. Number 3 now. Insula is that fifth lobe that I couldn't show you in that previous because of the limitation of the photos. But when you come to lab, the first thing I want you to do is look for that insula. You're going to open the frontal lobe. You're going to open the temporal lobe. You're just literally going to go into this lateral sulcus that divides it. You're going to open it. You can see that they have little tools here pulling it apart. And then inside you have your insula. That lobe is going to be responsible for taste. And so next, olfactory cortex. This is the area that's going to receive smell. Olfactory is a fancy word to mean smell. So that goes into that insula lobe as well. Number 5 is going to be your auditory or your ears. The temporal lobe is the closest lobe to your ears, like the temporal bone that had the external acoustic meatus. You remember that hole that was on that side bone on your skull? And then so that's for hearing. So it makes sense that temporal bone next to temporal lobe is going to have the primary auditory cortex, which is responsible for hearing sound. Auditory association area is where you recognize the difference between ah and oh. When they come into your ear, you can hear the difference because this region is what's like, it's like, okay, it's learned what those different sounds mean. Visual cortex is going to be the occipital lobe. This is going to be the visual cortex where you see things. So when you want to see things, visual, right, your eyeballs are here in the front of the brain. They travel into your thalamus, and the thalamus relays what you're seeing, the vision, the picture of it, back here in your occipital lobe, and you're able to see things because of that region. It can distinguish between colors, like blues and yellows. And maybe that doesn't mean much to anybody, but if anybody's watched their shows in black and white, it's not the same, right? Like, it's not the same to be able to distinguish between certain colors. Like, if you watch a black and white movie, you're missing out on a lot of detail. And some people see things in more grayscale, maybe even black and white, and that's because they can't distinguish between colors. And that's sort of the only way you can really understand that for those maybe who don't have any impairments in color vision. But that's what it does. It distinguishes between colors. Otherwise, things might look, black and white. So that's what this region can do. Now the cranial nerves and how to read this table. And so the cranial nerves here, you have 12 cranial nerves. And we'll go to a better image in a second. But this chart here, what you want to do is you want to learn 1 through 12. Know your Roman numerals. If you don't remember, 1, 2, and 3 are pretty easy. You have 3 dashes, means 3. Here, 5 is a V. Okay, that's the word you want. That's the one you want to remember, 5 and 10. Because 5 is a V, 10 is an X. So if you're at V and you're 1 before the V, it means 4. Okay? 1 before means 4. V, 1 before, an I before the 4 means 4. Now if you put that I or the I after V, it's a 6. You put 2 I's, 7, 3 I's to 8, and then now the different one, the X. X to us means number 10. So if the I is before the 10, it's 1 minus this one. Okay, so it's going to be 9. So this is 9. And then this is going to be 11 because the I is after the X. And then 2 after would be 12. And so we have 12. The names are olfactory, optic, ocular motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, spinal accessory, and hypoglossal. And I left this in, you don't need to know this, but I left this in because I thought it'd be cool for you to finally see how the bones, why'd you have to learn some of those things? Like these nerves exit the brain and they exit through something that maybe you're familiar with, like the jugular foramen, right? Remember that one? And also the superior orbital fissure, right? That was an important space for nerves to exit out and serve certain things. Like this one is easy to learn. Ocular motor, oculo eyes, motor muscles, eye muscle here, it moves muscles around the eyes. It had an exit around your superior orbital fissure. But see, it's pretty cool. You can understand that, right? But now this is the important thing to understand from here and what you need to know. Know the number, know the name, know if it is sensory, and know the function. You'll see that the function is tied very closely to this little box. This box is telling you whether it's one of your senses. Sensory is in blue. Sensory, smell. Easy, right? It's one of our senses. So the olfactory, a fancy word for smell, cranial nerve number 1 is responsible for smell. It's a sense. We already know that this is one of our 5 senses. So it's a sense. Sensory cell. Sensory nerve, sorry. And the optic nerve here, we know it's vision. What's vision? Sight. Is that a sense? Blue. Now, where it's different. Motor. Ocular motor meant to move your eyes. So that means that you're sending a signal away from your brain, moving a muscle around your eyes. And so that's going to be in red. So you can see that blue means that something's going into your brain. Red means that you're sending a command out to your muscles to move something. Trochlear does the same thing as ocular motor. That's why it's pretty easy to learn. It just moves one more eye muscle. And we learned these last eye muscles on our last day. But otherwise, you just need to know it moves eye muscles. That's all. Moves eye muscles. Easy peasy. Trigeminal now, you'll see that it's B, mixed. Mixed means that you have muscles of mastication or chewing. And here you can see it also has a blue. What was blue? Sense. So this one does both. It has red and blue powers. The powers to send signals out and the powers to send signals in. So it's mixed. It has both fibers running through it. And so one does touch on your face, and part of it also controls the muscles that chew. And you know them. What are they? Masseter and temporalis. So this nerve alone controls those. Abducens controls eye muscles as well. Easy peasy, right? 3, 4, and 6 control eye muscles. And then next, our facial controls facial expression muscles like the zygomaticus for smiling, but just facial expressions. And it controls the glands that we have in our skull, like submandibular, sublingual, lacrimal, our tier 1. And then taste, this is the nerve responsible for taste as well. So you can taste things on the tip of your tongue because of this nerve, mixed. You'll notice down here, we jump down, this one's also mixed. And taste, it controls the taste behind the tongue. So it's very complex how your tongue can taste. It's controlled by 2 different cranial nerves. And vestibular cochlear nerve is responsible for balance and hearing. And so there's an acronym for this. I'm not going to finish these. These you can pretty much learn them on your own. But where you really, I think, would help you if you write them in your test. You're welcome to write on your test. Write 1 through 12. And then you want to know this acronym. Some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. And I had to say it slower because I messed up, but let me fix it. And I'm not redoing this whole slide, so I'm going to just redo it, or I'll draw it here. S, B. When you, whoa. I take that back. Okay. The M is like saying both, right? Both motor and, oh, dang it, where am I keep writing it there? Sorry, everybody. I'm just trying to give you my acronym. I'm just trying to be as easy as possible here. B. And so now you have to imagine that there's a B on all the mixed, and that just means both, right? It has both motor and sensory. So it means the same thing. So S, I'm using the first letter for sense, S, and for M, I'm using the letter M. Okay, so it's S, S, M, M, B, M, B, S, B, B, M, M. And the acronym goes, if you start from 1 through 12, some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. Okay, if you need that, replay the video. But otherwise, sorry it took me so long to get there, but I promise that's going to help you. Remember the functions too. It lets you double check. And you need to know if it is sensory or motor or both. And you need to know what it does. And now I love this next image. I wish it wasn't upwards, but then this is a good way to practice with each one, because this is what it does, right? Olfactory, if you look at the function, it goes into your nose. The optic nerve, the ocular motor, the trochlear, and the abducens, they're all going to control extrinsic eye muscles, right? They all go to control muscles. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing each one of these little cables. Look at the names here. So as you learn them, practice it on these images. And with a picture, really learn the picture, and you really learn it really well, really fast, and really fun and easy way to learn them. And then lastly, I'm sorry I messed up. I said the optic nerve controls muscles. It does not. The optic nerve gets vision. Remember, it's sensory, goes in, and then it travels. Where does all senses go? The thalamus at some point, which is about here, and then the occipital lobe. right? Because the occipital lobe controls all that visual. And in motors, they're going to travel out and they're going to extend it. Hey, move, look up. Hey, look to the side. Okay, that's how you control that. Pretty cool, right? And again, don't forget, blue always means senses. If you smell something, it goes into your nose, goes into your olfactory sensors here, goes into the olfactory nerve number 2, and then it goes into your brain. And what lobe is responsible for olfactory or the sense of smell? Insula. And now just practice the same way for each one. Look at each picture, look for the nerve or circle the one that's there. Practice rehearsing the functions. Learn those pictures really well. It'll really help you to learn the names. And for the eye muscles, you only need to know that they control extrinsic eye muscles. You do not need to know which ones they move. And yes, and then this will be a subject for review on Tuesday. Here, the only thing I care for you to know is know these structures and practice finding them on the models, but you should be able to label a diagram like this that you see, like you see these blue horns in here, these blue, follow the arrows. These side ones here are going to be the lateral ventricles, lateral on the sides. We're going to come down to the very bottom, and then you're going to find the third ventricle. This third ventricle is going to be this space right in between. And then it has a fourth ventricle, but not yet. There's a little adapter called cerebral aqueduct. And why this matters to me and to you, and because this is where the source of cerebral spinal fluid is flowing. What cells make cerebral spinal fluid from our first video? Hopefully you're all saying, starts with an E. Ependymal cells. The ependymal cells were created cerebral spinal fluid, and now this is why this is so important, is that the cerebral spinal fluid, it gets filled up into these little spaces in here. What you're seeing when you look at these are like sacs in this shape in your brain. So aside from your cerebrum, your diencephalon, your cerebellum, your brainstem, you have this little structure just sitting in your brain, just letting the liquid CSF lubricate and arrive all over the brain, and even to go in so far into the spinal cord. You just need to know the names and be able to label this picture. I've made a study guide for you that I'll post this weekend that will have that little labeling exercise you should know. Some regions in your brain specialize in particular types of things, and they're typically referred to as integrative centers. And what this means is that you've learned that there are frontal lobes, parietal lobes, temporal lobes, insula, and sometimes there needs to be a communication between them, a coordination between them. And so we see that we've really found some very defined spaces that control certain functions. A very popular one is Broca's area, and this one controls your ability to produce speech. You regulate your breathing, and you're able to vocalize those patterns with the use of your tracheal muscles to control the sound, the tongue muscles. And so there's a lot of integration, a lot of coordination between many different parts of your brain working together. And Broca's area, again, is for motor speech area. One that's similar to it is Wernicke's area. That's going to be this larger region here. That's going to be more posterior. It learns language. It's the area that takes in your auditory information or information you hear and combines it with memory components of your brain. And so Wernicke's area is responsible for that. The frontal eye field controls eye movements. And how easy is that? But that's the crazy part, right? Is that where is all occipital information? Where does it go? Where does all visual information, like your optic nerve, right, that sends a simple signal from your eyeball and sends it to your brain? What part of your brain does it send it to? The occipital lobe, because the occipital lobe is responsible for visual cortex. If you haven't learned what the functions of each of the lobes are, take a break from this, go back, make sure you know your lobe functions, what they control, and then maybe coming back to this slide to finish it up. But otherwise, the frontal eye field will send signals to the motor cortex. And the motor cortex is the one that will move through the cranial nerves. It will send signals down into the brainstem and then use the cranial nerves that control the extrinsic eye muscles. Like, which ones did we just learn? I know that they're not fresh in your head, but abducens, trochlear, ocular motor. The ability to move those muscles is actually a power of will. When you want to move them, you choose to move them. But all the visual information is handled back here. So you see that this is what this is about, is understanding that the brain, even though one region is responsible for one thing, like motor in this case, or touch in this case, or sound in this case, or vision in this case, that there's still coordination among them. They need to work together. And so frontal eye field is that controlled eye movement. And the prefrontal cortex in general is where you integrate things as you're learning them. So sensory, as you're reading, right? Visual, as you're hearing them. And then that's why we say that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for intellectual functions. If you damage that part, this is what they lobotomize. You ever heard of a lobotomy back in the day? If you were really a pain or mentally ill, they were punishing by doing something called a lobotomy. It was done since medieval times, that they scrambled this part of your brain through your nose. And then you lose your personality. And so, crazy stuff. And also, I don't mean to say you're a burden if you have mental health or, disabled. I mean to say, if you were a burden, back then they used to do it to criminals. Like if you were in crime, like if you committed too many crimes and you were just too much to deal with, they would just do it to you. That's what I meant. And then also, they would also do it though to some people who were very mentally ill as well, if they were out of control. And so I wasn't trying to compare them, just trying to... Okay, I'm going to move on. You understand. And now, so putting it all together with our spinal cord, and we're not going to go too deep into peripheral nervous system. I feel like with the amount of time we have, this is a good spot to end it. It's just, what is the spinal cord now? I think that what I've given you, I feel like you will learn and be able to learn neuro component of any subject really well with the fundamentals I've given you for brain prior. And here, now, this is the information that's going to matter the most, is the organization around the spinal cord. So we were up here, we left the brain now. We started back here with sensory receptors. They send things in. You want to send signals out of your brain. They go out, motor output, and it's going to go control effectors like muscles, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Okay, these are the three muscles you know. Cardiac could be, skeletal muscles, the muscles you've seen throughout the whole anatomy journey in the last 3 weeks when you learn muscles, right? Biceps brachii, masseter, orbicularis oris. Smooth muscles in digestive, the circular layer, the longitudinal layer. Cardiac muscle in your your cardiovascular system in your heart. Okay? Those are signals going out. Motor outputs. Sometimes you have neuroglandular synapses where they control glands somewhere along your body, like your pancreas can be controlled by your brain, by neurons. Your adipose tissues as well. And now we're going to get into... let's keep going. And so here we keep going down the sensory receptors such as touch. They're going to go into your spinal cord. Remember that we said that when you touch something, they're part of the PNS outside of the spinal cord. Those receptors bring it in. They bring it into your spinal cord. And then at times, the spinal cord can decide to do anything else out here. Okay? So they can do it in two ways. You feel something, you can go up here, and then it goes up here for processing. And then if you want to move, it comes back out, and then it'll go and control the muscles in that space to remove it. And sometimes when we're talking about PNS in the PNS in this case, sometimes if it goes into your spinal cord and it doesn't go up, instead we call this a reflex. If it goes here and then instead of going upwards, for you to process it and say, okay, I'm going to move it. I don't like the way this feels. Instead, it goes here and a reflex, it sends the signal right out to the muscles right then and there. And I'll explain this idea again in the next slide where it'll make more sense in a second. Now, here our spinal cord has some organization. Here's our vertebral bone. You remember this spinous process, a transverse process? This looks like a transverse process to me. This looks like a body right in front. The spinal cord ran through the vertebral foramen, and we see that it is organized by layers. This little segment here is the spinal cord, and it has layers. Dura mater, the most outer one, named because it's hard matter, dura mater. The inside is called arachnoid mater because it's web-like, arachnoid mater. And then you have the pia mater, which is going to wrap directly around the spinal cord, pia mater. Innermost layer. These layers, the maters, are called meninges. Meninges. And that's why you see innermost meningeal layer here. This would be the middle meningeal layer. This would be the most outer meningeal layer. Meninges. And here you'll see that we have gray matter. When you look at the center of our spinal cord now, you'll always see this little butterfly. And this little butterfly is called gray matter, and the outside is called white matter. And yes, it is exactly what you know it is. What do you expect to find here in gray matter? 5 seconds. What do you expect to find in gray matter? Next question. What do you expect to find in the white matter? So for gray matter, you should have answered cell bodies. There's a bunch of cell bodies here. A bunch of cell bodies with a bunch of nuclei there. And on the outside, what do we say when we say white matter? A bunch of bundles of axons that are myelinated. So when you look at this image, now we're going to have to translate this. We've been looking at now, we're going to have to look all the way up here now. You'll notice that this gray matter is going to be a bunch of cell bodies sitting in here. And then all of these neurons, I'm going to try to draw it as best as I can. All these little nuclei are pretty much situated within this space. And they're gray because there's no myelin there. And within the spinal cord, they send their axons through the white matter. So these white matters, I know that what you have to think about white matter as pathways. Like little pathways, and each one's going to contain a bundle of fibers that goes in one direction and goes another direction, but they're organizing all the axons like a zip tie, bundling a bunch of axons together. And so some of them will be ascending tracks. Some of them will be descending tracks, like coming to connect at that level. And if you're not understanding what I'm saying, is like, think about this. This level right here, where you're seeing this bone down here, that's T1, right? Up here, this would be the space for T2, or this one would be the space for T1. So T1, T2, T3. 1, 2, 3. And when you think about the vertebra, the gray matter, if we're looking at my little drawings, you can see I have all these little nuclei here. And that's why it's gray. And then their axons, they leave from that segment, and if they're going to travel down, they'll travel down through the white matter. And then when they want to go back in, they go back in through the gray matter. And then they connect onto the ones at that level. Okay? And so you just have this whole fundamental process occurring in the whole brain. Is that the gray matter is responsible for relay centers down this dead center. And then here in green, let me actually redraw it on this one. That essentially what you have is this network of the center being relay centers of nuclei, and then the white matter serves as traffic for either going ascending tracks, meaning going up, or descending tracks going down. And so that's really it as far as tracks go, or white matter goes, is that it's a form of pathway for axons, and gray matter is a location for the cell bodies. And now think about this too, okay, because this is going to sum up the rest of it. When you look at the way your spine, let me switch to my laser. When you look at here, the spinal cord here, you can see that it's situated again between its meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, right? Those are the meningeal layers, the layers that surround that little burrito wrap that we just went over here, okay? If you look inside, you'll also see that there's going to be nerves that exit it and come into it. See, that's what this little yellow portion is, and that little yellow portion, this yellow and this yellow. If you go up here now without the bone, you can see up here and down here, up here, down here. And what's so cool about the organization about the spinal cord is that, do you see the large bulgy one here? That's always going to be sensory, okay? And I want you to think about what that means. When we think about touch, right, this is the brain, this is the spinal cord, and you have to imagine a whole body around it. If you touch something, it goes in through your arm, goes into your spinal cord, and into your spinal cord is the key word there, into your spinal cord. So when touch comes in, the sensation of touch, the action potentials are traveling through these axons. They go and they enter this little space called the ganglion, the posterior root ganglion. And this is going to have a bunch of cell bodies, and it's bringing in the action potentials for touch. And then what is it going to do? It's going to send it into the gray matter, and then send it to the white matter and into the brain. One more time with this image. It's going to go in through the posterior root ganglion, the sense of touch, go into your gray matter, and go at this level. Okay, let's pretend like we're right here at this level. It came in through the dorsal root ganglion. You can see it here, the posterior root ganglion, or here. It comes in, touch, goes into the gray matter, and then how does it go up? Through one of these, the white matter, and then it goes up the ascending track. Okay? And then it's going to travel up into your brain. And then now your brain's going to send a signal, right, to move it from the precentral gyrus. Send it all the way down. And what is it going to use to do that? It's going to use the white matter, because it's going to be descending. And then it says, okay, I need to exit right here. And it's going to exit out through not the dorsal one, or not the posterior one where we have this one, but the anterior root. So back up here, the posterior root is responsible for handling all sense of touch. The one with the posterior root ganglion, a little bulge with a bunch of, the reason it's called that is because it has a bunch of nucleus in it. And here an anterior root is going to be a root that handles efferent signals, or signals going out, action potentials traveling out to travel to the muscles. So sensory goes in this way, and motor goes out this way. The anterior root is responsible for motor actions. The posterior root is responsible for sensory actions. And then lastly, they all group up at some point though. Like you'll notice that they all bundle up and they group up, and then they bundle into one thing, and that one thing is a spinal nerve. And that's all I want you to gather from here. And I'm going to sum it up now. Know the meningeal layers, the order, which one's more superficial to deep. Know what the posterior root is responsible for. Know what the anterior root is responsible for. Know what white matter is representative of. The tracks, like we mentioned over here, the tracks, descending and ascending tracks. Know that the gray matter has to do with nuclei. Okay, that's where the nuclei exit and meet. And that's really all I really want you to gather from this slide. Now, when we examine the actual segments themselves, okay, the cool thing is, this is stuff you already know. And I keep saying it's cool. It's just also, I love all the nervous stuff so much. But anyways, when you think about like the vertebra at each every single level here, remember how many you had? Don't let this trick you. How many did you have? It says 8 on here on this page. But how many did we actually, vertebra did we have? Bones. 7. And what were all of them? Do you remember the levels? It was 7, 12, 5. And then sacrum was fused at the time, right? But now what those vertebrae provided were exit sites for nerves. So you can see now that the spinal cord is essentially that gray matter, that white matter, and those anterior and ventral roots leaving the spinal cord to go serve the body wherever it needed to go. And so if you exited above the first bone, what was our first bone? Atlas. Atlas is going to be, there's going to be a nerve that exits on top of it. There's going to be a nerve that exits under it. And so C1 is the one above it, C2 is the one below it, and that's why it goes all the way to C8. Because one goes above C1 bone. C1 nerve comes out of C1 bone. I hope that makes sense. But otherwise, these are the segments that we have. They're all going to go serve organs all over your body and muscles all over your body. And if you examine those spinal nerves, right, if we grab one of those spinal nerves, right, that we saw on the previous page, if you're not sure what a spinal nerve is yet, make sure you go to the very end of the video of the previous one, segment, previous slide. And if you examine and slice one open, what you see with those nerves, these bundles, these fibers, I was never kidding you when I told you it's just a bundle of axons. When you look at an anterior root or at a ventral root, like from the previous slide, those are what exiting out of here on the side here, the little spiky ends, that's what you're seeing there. And if you slice one, they're just a bundle. Here's our axon, myelinated axon, with a Schwann cell right around it. And this Schwann cell is a cell that produces myelin in the PNS, in the peripheral nervous system. See how we're coming full circle now. We're done with this. Here, the Schwann cell wraps around the myelin axon, providing myelin, just like what cells did it for the central nervous system? What was the name of the glial cell that helps myelinate the axons in central nervous system? Oligodendrocytes. Now when you look at this, the Schwann cells, this is just one axon from one neuron. Who knows where it's coming from, but it's connected to something. It's going in, and then you'll see all of these little circles represent an axon. And all of these axons have a Schwann cell around them with a myelin sheath, and then one more thing, an endoneurium. And I'm sorry if I spoke slowly. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. It's just tricky, and I want to be very clear. After the Schwann cell, we have a myelinated sheath, and right above it, we have an endoneurium. The endoneurium is around every axon. Every single axon you see in here has one endoneurium. Now, if you look at this picture here, every single blue circle there is wrapped around by an endoneurium. Every single little blue circle. Make sure you understand that. Now the perineurium. That's the next layer of organization. That's going to be wrapped around, if we still stay on this one, endoneurium. All of these axons have endoneurium. And then now you only have one perineurium wrap. Do you see that? That's the wrap. And a bundle of neurons like this is called a fascicle. And so a fascicle is a bundle of axons. And the perineurium is the wrap around the fascicle, around the bundle. The perineurium represents the connective tissue, right? Like if you have all these bundles right here, you're seeing all of these little yellow ones with blue circles, they all have their own single purple wrap. Every single one of those purple ones is a perineurium. And it's not just the wrap, though. It's also the space outside. It's like a connective tissue layer. It fills it with areolar tissue so that the blood vessels can arrive and nourish these axons. And what type of nourishment do these axons need? What ions is very important to the action potential in an axon. Sodium and potassium, right? To produce the action potential across this, so that a signal, a nervous impulse, travels along all these axons. And action potential just means the flow of sodium going in, going in, and as it goes in, potassium goes out, and then the sodium potassium fixes it, right? That's what, hopefully you've gotten that narrative down by now. And that's going to be the subject of our review on Tuesday. Epineurium now is going to be this outer layer here. It's going to be the most outer connective tissue that holds all the perineurium together. So you can see perineurium really makes up the most of it. Endoneurium surrounds every single axon. The word fascicle means bundle. Know everything I just stated. On the spinal cord, a thing that we find is something called the conus medullaris. And that's going to be this little cone, little shaped structure that we find here. And lastly, you find the filum terminale, which is going to be a small, little, tiny extension, like a little fiber that comes out from this segment. Conus medullaris, filum terminale. Now, this is nothing that you don't know. So if you're a little exhausted, take a break. And this is something that I really want to explain the organization to you and finish up on this. Quick pop quiz. What was the posterior root responsible for? Well, let's look at this image up here. What was the posterior root for? What was the anterior root for? Hopefully you answered. Posterior root is for sensory. And then the anterior root was for motor, meaning signals go out to control muscles. Anything that you're feeling, touch, pain, pressure, anything's going into the spinal cord and then going into the posterior root, the back one. And I know this is the posterior root because it has a posterior root ganglion, which is just a bundle of nuclei. Now, what's important to distinguish now is in this anterior gray horn, you have a bunch of nuclei, okay? And then you'll notice here, that's written here for you. Motor nuclei, here's the portion that controls motor. You have a bunch of nuclei, cell bodies, okay? A bunch of cell bodies that are in this little spot. They're in this little spot, and they are sending their axons out through the white matter, whether it's this way, or going up this way to travel up the spinal cord. Motor nuclei. Sensory nuclei are going to be nuclei that are in the CNS, in the spinal cord, that again are sending impulses inside and going into the posterior horn here, or this posterior portion. And the nuclei are there. Now I keep saying here, the posterior root ganglion, this little bulge here, I keep calling it a ganglion. But a ganglion is the same thing as saying the word nuclei. When I say the word nuclei, I'm saying that there's just a bunch, let me draw it. There's a bunch of nuclei here. A bunch of nuclei. But when it is inside of the CNS, which is the spinal cord, it's called nuclei. When it's a bunch of, if we look here now, ganglion, that just means it's the same thing. But now what do you guys notice about the boundary here? Where are we? Are we in CNS? No, we are in PNS, peripheral nervous system. It's the exact same word, but the ganglion means outside PNS. Nuclei that are bundled up outside the PNS. And so the last point to take from this. Here you'll notice that all the ventral side, if you've kept up with me so far, that you remember that this ventral side is responsible for motor, what do you guys think this part of the gray matter is going to be responsible for? Motor. So is this region. So everything here in the front, the anterior horn is what it's called. Let me get rid of it. It's here right here for you already. anterior horn. See this? That's going to be this front portion here. The posterior horn is going to be in the back. Don't forget, this is the posterior root ganglion, sensory, posterior gray horn. Now to sum up, the nuclei for sensory, sensation, are in the posterior gray horn. The ones for motor nuclei are all located in the anterior, and that's going to be just this little front region here. The last region is the lateral gray horn, and it controls, for our sake and purposes, controls motor nuclei as well. So very simply, gray horn controls motor, ventral anterior root controls motor, posterior root ganglion controls sensory, the posterior root controls sensory, the posterior gray horn controls sensory. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And this image now is only summing up that very thing. So don't let it intimidate you, okay? Because I know when I look at it right now, even I'm like getting worried. But I look at it, I'm like, oh, it's stuff that, this is a nice visual to sum it all up. Here you get some sort of action potential traveling down the axon, going into our ganglion, right? This is a ganglion, okay? A ganglion. And remember, this is a ganglion. I know it is because what does a little bulge mean? It means it's a ganglion. And what is a ganglion? A bunch of nuclei in here. Now, this is a separate ganglion, okay? I've only taught you about one. What is this one? Posterior root ganglion. So whenever you see this ganglion, like a little bulge, that's a ganglion, okay? A bunch of nuclei cell bodies. But that's neither here or there, okay? And so back to this. What I want you to just get is that if we're traveling through here, right, maybe visceral, you know what? We can do it. Let's go through it. Interoreceptors of visceral organs. You all know what a visceral organ is, digestive. You're getting a signal from some inside receptor, inside of that region. It goes in, and it's maybe a sensation that you're feeling, right? Maybe you're getting a sensation that food is touching a particular part of your organ. And if I'm sensation, right, where does sense come into the spinal cord? Which root? Through the posterior root, because that's a sense of sensation. This might be a tough one, but we do this one here. This one will be easier to understand. Let's say someone touches you, okay? On the body wall, here, the body wall or the limbs. Someone touches you or is pushing you, and that sensation goes in. What is the sense of touch? Is it sensory? Is it motor? Someone's pushing you. Sense, touch. And where is that signal going to be coming in from? Go into the posterior root. It goes in through the sensation. And where is it going to focus on? If it has to go into the gray matter, which region of the gray matter do we care about? The posterior gray horn. Because the posterior gray horn delivers all sensory information. It deals with it and then decides what it's going to do with it. Now, the only difference between these two arrows now, blue is easy to understand. Blue is everything you've known so far. Touch. When you want to send touch is the best one. That's the only one, really, when you're looking at that. And then so these somatic sensations can be like sense of touch. Blue comes in only to the back end. Visceral, more complicated to understand. But what this typically means is that it's just things coming from your inside of your sensory information coming from the inside of your organs. Like your smooth muscles are detecting food. So it knows it has to tell certain parts of your brain that there's food there to start those peristalsis movements, to contract the longitudinal and circular muscles. Do you see what I mean by autonomic? Like that signals come in from the organs in here, go into the brain, tell the brain, hey, there's food in here, maybe we should start passaging it or start secreting some acids, start secreting some digestive enzymes because I feel food in here. Did you ever have to think about that? That's what autonomic is. And so that's what this, when in Brown is explaining, is that all the sensations that your body is keeping track of that you don't even really care about to keep track of are being regulated in the same way that touch is. It's being sorted to the posterior portion, the posterior root. And now this one isn't any more complicated. Motor commands, are they going to be leaving the spinal cord or coming into the spinal cord? Where are the action potentials going? Outside or inside the spinal cord? Hopefully you're answering outside the spinal cord. So they travel outside the spinal cord and then they go and find their muscle. So that's why the direction now isn't going inwards, it's going outwards. So our best place to start is going to be here. The anterior root with axons of motor neurons. Here's our signal. We travel from the brain. We arrived at this level, C1 or C10. Sorry, there's no C10. C8 or T10, T12. It doesn't matter. It's all the same. It comes down from the brain, connects at the level it wants to exit. And it's all common sense at this point. Like T1 is around what? Above your shoulder? So all the nerves, like it's a command to move my arm, it's going to exit from maybe T1, T2, maybe C8, C7, because those are the same level. It's going to exit where? Through that anterior root. So the action potentials of the nerve impulses travel out through the ventral root, and then they go out to serve whatever it is they're going to do. And in this case, for example, let's follow our easy one, the blue one. The blue one sends, you want to move your muscle, it comes out of the spinal cord, out at level T1, let's say, travels out, sends the action potential, and it'll go control a skeletal muscle, like your biceps brachii. This one will control a visceral motor nuclei, and so it will move like contractions in your muscles, for your smooth muscles. Visceral motor control. So remember I told you to try not to be afraid of the word somatic. It means body. In our case, most of the time, skeletal muscles. When it says visceral, it's talking about all the stuff that's precious to us inside of our abdominal cavities that we don't really want to take care of. Digestive tract, for example. So visceral is a command to the digestive tract to move, to do contractions in the digestive tract, the smooth muscle. So you can see these are just sending signals outwards through the ventral root, not the posterior root. And you can call these dorsal root or ventral root. It's the same thing. Anterior root is the same thing as ventral root, just as posterior root is the same thing as dorsal root. So I use them interchangeably there sometimes. And so with that, that's it. Understand the organization around the spinal cord. And this is what we're going to focus on our review, along with the cranial nerves when we come back on Tuesday. Happy studying.